I did my graduate work in computer science at the MIT AI lab. The last time AI was all the rage, and this time, hopefully, it's a little different. For those of you who are smiling, you probably remember those days. Then I spent the last about 10 years at Google, and when I was there most recently, I had the privilege, among other things, of helping Google launch its autonomous vehicle effort at a time when everyone thought the company was absolutely crazy. And here we are a few years later, and everybody's in full swing. And then, as mentioned, I headed the US Patent and Trademark Office. And I raise that because that gives me a perspective on how federal agencies and Congress make policy decisions and decide matters generally. And so this quarter, I'm teaching at Stanford on disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, and driverless cars, and how disruptive technologies inherently butt up against existing laws and regulations designed for the present and not the future. So we'll have an interesting conversation today on some of the regulations and so forth, and also some of the ethical issues associated with driverless cars. So autonomous vehicle work is one of the most tangible use cases of artificial intelligence. It illustrates what is possible with increased computational power, constant connectivity, proliferation of sensors all around the vehicle, and predictive analytics, as well as other major breakthroughs that have been themes of the conference over these past 2 days. Autonomous vehicles, of course, is a key component to any digital city plans. And we have all been hearing about the tremendous improvements in terms of reduction in automotive industry automotive injuries and harms. It can be reduced through autonomous vehicles, as well as the increases in efficiencies in transportation. So we're witnessing now, we see it in the Valley, and we even see it beyond, a real proliferation of startups in every part of the ecosystem, and almost every major automobile manufacturer has an autonomous vehicle play: Toyota, BMW, General Motors, Ford, and the list goes on. In addition to, of course, Waymo, Uber, Tesla, and Zoox. So there's plenty of activity in this area. So here we go. This is the overview in the panel discussion today. We'll be discussing the regulatory landscape in the United States as well as the European Union for driverless cars. Then we'll discuss the ethical issues and approaches taken by the United States, the European Union, and one country in particular, Germany. So I'm going to take you back to, for those of you who are Americans, to your high school civics class. And if you'll recall, there are 3 ways you get laws or regulations. First is through passage of a bill by a legislative body. At the federal level, that's Congress. At the state level, of course, for example, the state of California will have its legislative body. The second way to get a regulation is through executive branch rulemaking. So, for example, I worked for the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration is an executive branch agency. Those agencies undergo requests for comments on a topic, they put forth proposed rules, and they get input from the public, and then they make decisions, put forth proposed rules, and finally issue final rules which constitute the regulations which are also binding, just like law. And the third way you get laws and regulations is through the court system interpreting a statute and rendering case law. So there are really only 3 ways to get it, and those are the 3. In the driverless car area, there's a lot of regulatory activity going on in the United States. And what I want to do is I want to focus on, first, the legislative activity. And at the federal level, the legislative activity is occurring at both the federal and the state level. At the federal level, there are 2 bills that are proposed. One is a bill proposed in the House called the Self-Drive Act. It's actually H.R. 3388. And there's another bill which is substantially similar to, though not identical to, the House bill, and it was introduced in the Senate, called the AV START Act. And basically, these 2 pieces of legislation have the following commonalities. They both clarify the roles and responsibility of federal regulation versus state regulation. And jurisdictionally, it breaks down as follows. The federal laws will regulate the safety of the motor vehicle and equipment within a car. And the state laws will regulate licensing. Think of when you go to the California Department of Motor Vehicle, you take the driver's license test, that has to do with licensing. Traffic rules, as well as insurance requirements and other aspects of operations. So they have distinct areas of jurisdiction. And the bill clarifies and delineates the federal area versus the state. Also, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration has the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, and these are the safety standards by which auto manufacturers need to comply. Now, in the United States, you don't have to submit your automobile to be tested by the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration before it goes on the market. You comply with the safety standards, and then it's a self-certification system. And only if there's problems, then the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration can recall the product. So right now, the way the federal motor vehicle safety standards are drafted, some of the provisions are out of date. They assume, for example, that there's a driver who has to have a rear view mirror that looks clearly out to the back for vision. But what happens when you don't have a driver? So the regulations have been a bit out of date, and companies, autonomous vehicle companies, have been requesting interpretations and exemptions and have been encouraging NHTSA to update its safety standards. So the bill's House and Senate version don't really set forth prescriptive requirements, but what they do say is they say that over a certain time period, the Department of Transportation needs to engage in rulemaking to provide updates to the now potentially out-of-date federal motor vehicle safety standards. So that's another provision that you see in the bills. Another one requires that the driverless car manufacturers have written cybersecurity and privacy policies. It does not articulate what those policies should be, only that the driverless car manufacturers need to have it in writing. So you can see it's a rather light touch to some of these issues. And let me keep all of this in mind because we'll compare it to the European regulations as well. A third provision or fourth provision in the bill sets forth the number of Department of Transportation rulings on exemptions from the current rules. So for example, if the rule you believe as a driverless car manufacturer does not apply or should not apply to you, you can submit a writing to the Department of Transportation, actually NHTSA, and say, I believe I should be exempted from this rule. And there are a certain number of limits, and so the bill actually increases the number of exemptions, allowing more flexibility to test and so forth. So that's another provision you see in the bill. And additionally, it requires the driverless car manufacturers to report to the Department of Transportation on how they are addressing system safety, cybersecurity, recording of data, operating system security, and vehicle crashworthiness. So again, I draw your attention to the fact that they're not saying you must meet this requirement, this requirement, this requirement. They're just saying, tell us how you are meeting X, Y, and Z, what you're doing in these areas. What's the state of play of these two bills? Well, the House bill passed out of the subcommittee and passed the entire House. And then the Senate bill passed the subcommittee, but encountered difficulties when passing the entire Senate. So again, think back to your high school civics. You have to have the bills pass through both bodies in order for it to go. So right now, there's no federal legislation that has been passed on this area. Those two bills are still unpassed and still pending. And we're at the stage where Congress is basically having a lot of hearings, bringing in a lot of driverless car companies, various people in the ecosystems, various stakeholder groups, including safety advocates, to come in to provide testimony as they evaluate next steps. So that's what's happening on the legislative front at the federal level. At the state level, we have 50 states. And there's a hodgepodge of legislation that has been passed by the various states. Some have none, some have some legislation. And what I will say is that just yesterday, the California legislature passed law that says vehicles no longer need to have drivers inside during testing. But the driverless cars being tested on public roads must have a remote operator monitoring at all times, ready to take over as needed. And the remote operator must also be able to communicate with police as well as any passengers in the event of an accident. So this is a major development for driverless car research and development efforts. In the past, you had to have a driver there. And so this is a major development in the state of California. But California is, as you know, only one of 50 states. And right now, a handful of states, as I said, have passed a hodgepodge of regulations at the state government level. And this has been frustrating for a lot of driverless car manufacturers. And one executive, in his testimony to Congress not so long ago from an industry official, lamented having to deal with 50 sets of state rules that can dramatically differ from state to state. He said, in the past 2 years, 23 states have introduced 53 pieces of legislation that affect self-driving cars, all of which include different approaches and concepts. 5 states have passed such legislation, and although all were intended to assist the development of technology in their states, none of the laws feature common definitions, common licensing structures, or common sets of expectations for what manufacturers should be doing. All of this complicates the task for car developers who need a more unified approach. Companies can't design cars for Texas that can't operate in Illinois, Florida, or New York. So a challenge that lies ahead is to overcome the fragmentation of 50 states' governments' legislation, and that does not even take into account the various legislative and regulatory approaches that are taken internationally, folded on top of the 50 states. That is an issue that is being worked out. There was a clear delineation, I said, between federal and state jurisdictions, and there has been some talk about the advantages of federal preemption over state, but again, not trying to step on the toes in the areas where state has historically had jurisdiction. So that's the state of play on the legislative front, both federal and state level. Let me turn now to executive branch agency. At the federal level, the Department of Transportation and NHTSA, that's the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, issued its first autonomous vehicle policy, what I call version 1.0, in September of 2016. And you can see on the slide there, that's the full title of it. And 1 year later, it issued version 2.0. So within 1 year, you've got 2 different versions of NHTSA's autonomous vehicle policy. Basically, the policy, first one, intended to foster the development of the autonomous vehicle industry. It laid out a framework, the 5 levels of autonomy from basically no autonomy to completely autonomous under all circumstances, under all environments as level 5, and then of course the levels in between. And the policy was meant to facilitate promulgation of rules related to each of those levels of autonomy. The policy opted to issue merely recommendations and best practices and were not mandatory requirements. It was criticized by some for its vagueness and lack of specificity and lack of prescriptive requirements or rules. The policy outlines, as I said, best practices for safe, highly autonomous vehicle design, development, and testing, and then manufacturers were encouraged but not required to submit safety assessments. So, for example, in response to this policy, you saw Waymo issue a safety assessment, and then most recently, GM through Cruise also submitted voluntarily a safety assessment. And the manufacturers were to report on their safety assessments on the issue of data recording and data sharing, vehicle cybersecurity, and crashworthiness, as well as ethical considerations and validation methods and how they tested their vehicle. And again, this is all voluntary. It's interesting to note the difference between version 1.0 and 2.0, among other things, is that the recommendation to provide how the companies were dealing with both ethics and, let's see, data sharing and privacy were removed. So ethics, privacy, and data sharing were removed as reporting requirements between version 1.0 and 2.0. So again, hold that in the back of your mind as you compare it to the European approaches to the regulatory issues. So in addition to the policy reports on driverless cars issued by the Department of Transportation and NHTSA, what you're seeing the alphabet soup of federal regulatory agencies engaging in a lot of rulemaking. So requests for comments, formulation of proposals, getting input. So they're really in the very earliest stages of information gathering, and there have been very few promulgated concrete rules. Now, let's turn to the international arena, particularly Europe. And here, the European Union Parliament has passed a resolution, and they passed it on February 16th, 2017, with recommendations to the European Commission on civil law rules on robotics. And basically, in this resolution, it accepts the following premises: that rules governing liability and ethics are necessary. And this is just a summary. You'll have to look at the document. It's much more than this, but I wanted to give you a highlight and a sense of what's in this resolution. That the EU can play an essential role in establishing basic ethical principles to be respected in the development, programming, and use of robotics and AI. That the development of robotic technology should focus on complementing human capabilities and not replacing them. Do we see that in any of the legislative recommendations in the United States? No, we don't. Furthermore, it goes on to say that it's essential to guarantee humans have control over intelligent machines at all times. Again, do we have that kind of premise in our rulemaking or legislative activities? We do not. Existing rules on liabilities are insufficient and call for new rules which focus on how a machine can be held responsible for acts and omissions. So these are just some of the premises in the EU resolution. The resolution calls on the Commission to, among other things, consider a system of registering advanced robots. Any suggestion of that in the United States? No. Consider a guiding ethical framework for design, production, and use of robots, including a proposal of a code of conduct for robotics engineers. That's an interesting proposal. Consider the guiding ethical framework should be based on principles of beneficence, human dignity, equality, non-discrimination, informed consent, private and family life and data protections, as well as transparency and social responsibility. So pretty specific considerations here for the ethical guidelines. Encourage transparency so that it is always possible to provide rationale behind any decision taken with the aid of AI that can have substantive impact on one or more persons' lives. So we had discussions earlier in this conference about the desirability of transparency, but this is really making it very concrete. Further, consider that advanced robots should be equipped with a black box which records data on every transaction carried out by including logic that contributed to its decision. So this was also a proposal set forth in the NHTSA, National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration's policy proposal number 1. So the US was considering something like this, but it was removed from policy version number 2. So this gives you a sense of where Europe is heading in terms of its approach to regulating AI and robotics and relatedly driverless cars. I want to go to Germany's approach on a very narrow issue, really, but the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure's Ethics Commission, and note that they have an Ethics Commission, promulgated an ethics rule regarding autonomous vehicles, stating that any distinction based upon personal features, age, gender, physical, or mental constitution is strictly prohibited. And parties involved in generation of mobility risks, that is, driverless car companies, must not sacrifice non-involved parties. So let me step back for a second. There's a lot of literature that's being written that talks about the trolley car dilemma, right? What happens if you've got an autonomous vehicle, it's heading down the road, it cannot avoid injury or harm, and it has to make a decision, right? Do you spare the occupants within the car? Now we're kind of going into the ethical and the moral side of this conversation in this panel. Do you save the life of the individuals within the driverless car at any and all cost versus the pedestrian? The pedestrian in this case would be the non-involved party, right? Because they're not involved in the relationship between the driverless car company and the passenger or the purchaser of the car or the user of the car. So what are the relationships and obligations to pedestrians and others on the road? So that's what the second bullet point gets to. The first bullet point, again, going back to the trolley car problem, is let's say that the autonomous vehicle is driving down the street, a collision is going to occur, damage is going to occur. Should the driverless car algorithm take into account the age of the pedestrians that may be hit? How many pedestrians might be hit? Should they take into account the social status or the social importance of the individuals? Because one day we might be able to through facial recognition. Should you take into account the gender of the individual in determining which decision to make? So these are all moral, ethical issues, and the algorithms at some point may need to take this into account, because when we assess an automobile accident, when we determine whether or not the algorithmic decision-making was correct, some of these factors actually may come into play. And the MIT Media Lab did a very interesting study on, it's called the Moral Machine Study, and basically it was this online survey that surveyed millions of people across the planet. And it presented various fact scenarios, precisely as I articulated. A driverless car is heading down a street. In scenario one, you've got an old lady crossing the street, and you've got so many people inside the car. And it asked all the people who were participating in the survey to provide an answer. And again, across the globe, all different cultures, all different values. And what's interesting is that the answers given, not surprisingly, are not entirely consistent. So it can vary by culture in terms of what a culture values. So the question is, as I look across the landscape, the engineers are working very hard to kind of make these algorithms as accurate as possible, but might there not be a role for folding in some moral values? And if so, do you fold in the moral values of the country in which it's designed, but what if that value differs from other countries? And might you be programming the driverless car differently depending upon where the final use of that vehicle may be? And is that okay? So I've just asked a lot of questions that I provided no answers to, but hopefully that gets you thinking along the lines of, well, roughly what the state of regulation is in the United States in the area of driverless cars, federal, state, and in Europe, but also some of the ethical issues that are associated with autonomous cars or driverless cars and some of the work that's being done in the area.